Hi guys, I hope you're ready to start working on your writing because I'm here today to talk to you about conflict, most importantly internal versus external conflict, and why both are crucial for your story. Now before we get started, I just have to do a quick promotion. These are my two latest releases and I'd love you to go out and buy a copy. We've got Wives of War here and also Hearts of Resistance. They're both Kindle #1 bestsellers and I would love you to read either of those books. Now, getting into conflict. So, what is conflict? I think when I was starting out, conflict was one of the hardest things for me to understand. I knew what conflict was, but I didn't understand how important internal conflict was for a romance novel or women's fiction novel. And I think I was so focused on external conflict, and I want to cover off with you what the difference is between those two things. So first of all, what is conflict? In a nutshell, conflict is what goes wrong in the novel, what goes wrong for your characters, and what goes wrong for, I guess, for the world that they're in. Little Red Riding Hood is a great example at its absolute most basic form of what conflict is. So we all know the story of Little Red Riding Hood. This is an example I use when I talk to students in schools, and I think it's something we can all relate to. So Little Red Riding Hood is the main character. We all know that. The story is that Little Red Riding Hood has to go to her grandmother's house. So if we looked at that story, Little Red Riding Hood, great, nice character in her beautiful red jacket, and she goes to grandma's house and she just happens to go there, see her grandma and come home again. That would be a really boring story to read. It would also be very boring to write. So if you look at the conflict in that story, it's obviously the big bad wolf. Now, the big bad wolf is a really important component to that story because he creates the conflict. The story is exciting because on her way to grandma's house, Little Red Riding Hood encounters this wolf, and then the wolf ends up dressed up in grandma's clothing at the house. So we have to look at the importance of the wolf in that novel. I'm not saying you need a wolf in your novel, but you do need conflict. So what's internal conflict? Internal conflict is what's in here with the characters. It relates to their backstory and it's about what's gone wrong for them, what's affected them in the past, what is it about them that's created this conflict that then goes on to create internal conflict with another character. The internal conflict in a romance novel is what is keeping the hero and heroine apart. In one of my novels, I Knew You Were Trouble, which was published by St. Martin's Press, I used a classic romance trope, which was the hero falling in love with his best friend's little sister. But that isn't enough conflict on his own. That is the romance trope, and it's the starting point, which is great. But the conflict that kept them apart was the hero, who had been quite the womanizer up to that point. He didn't want to jeopardize his friendship with his best friend. He didn't want to hurt someone who he cared about, which happened to be the heroine. And he was also held back by his desire to protect her without wanting to develop into a relationship. For the heroine, she had always had a crush on the hero, but she had been in an abusive relationship, and that is key to her internal conflict. She knew that she should trust the hero, but because of her past conflict in the past relationship, she actually couldn't do that, and it took a lot for her to work through those issues. So they were the internal conflicts for my characters. If your internal conflict is simple enough that you could put the two main characters, in this case the hero and heroine in a romance novel, in the same room together and let them talk for say 5 minutes to an hour, and they could resolve those conflicts or those personal issues, you don't have enough internal conflict. The conflict needs to sustain the entire story. Yes, they can overcome small parts of their internal conflict throughout the story, which is great because it keeps the story progressing. The internal conflict can't be resolved until the end. The external conflict is what is happening in the world around the characters, or just within their own household, within their personal characters' situation. So for instance, if there was a fire, that would be an external conflict. If you had in a romance novel a hero and heroine who, say it was a Christmas novel and they were somewhere and they got stuck in the snow, and that kept them together and prevented them from, say, leaving somewhere and putting them in that situation together, that is external conflict. So it's very important to the novel, and it often is the basis for bringing your characters together, or on a bigger scale, it could have a much bigger impact and could be very important to the story, and you couldn't have that story without the external conflict. But it can't be the only thing to sustain your story. Your characters need to have backstory and conflict, internal conflict of their own that keeps them apart and keeps the reader turning the page. It stops the story from being boring. It helps you get past what could be called a saggy middle, where the middle can be hard going for the reader and for the writer, and it really needs to sustain the story right until the end. Planning out your conflict is as important as planning out your characters. You need to know what your conflict is. If you are pitching the story to an agent or editor, or even just talking to other authors about your story, you should be able to determine and say straight away what the conflict is. What is keeping your characters apart? What is the conflict that is driving the entire story? And that is really important for you to know right from the outset. I personally wouldn't start a story unless I knew what my conflict was. And that's also about understanding your characters and crafting strong characters. Understanding the conflict in your story and the conflict that your characters are faced with internally will really show you who your characters are. It will show you their motivations, and it will help you to show the reader what type of characters they are and why it's crucial to their story that they have these internal conflicts and they have their own personal backstory. But it's also important not to throw that backstory on the page. You need to be really careful about how you feed the conflict and the backstory of each character onto the page and into your story. You have to weave it in really carefully so that you're not just information dumping on your reader. You need to really give those little bits of conflict and backstory onto the page and to the reader through dialogue, through interactions with other characters on the page, so that we slowly understand who the characters are. And it also means that we can understand their actions. If you have a heroine that backs away from a hero because they're scared, and it may not be something that would be right for every female in terms of how they've behaved in the situation. But if you've had someone in an abusive relationship who has trust issues, then obviously they have a different conflict and a different backstory and different reactions to that other characters may have. Your key conflict needs to be apparent in your query letters to agents and editors. If there is no conflict, an agent or editor will know that there really is no story. So make sure you're really strong in what is driving the story, what the conflicts are, what is keeping the characters apart, especially if you're writing romance. If you're writing women's fiction, you still need those same conflicts and that same strong, deep backstory for your characters to keep the story moving, so we can really see your characters grow throughout the story. Next week, I'm going to be talking about crafting strong characters and how to go about starting a story and creating your characters first. Don't forget, subscribe to my channel if you've enjoyed this video and you want to hear more. The only way I can keep delivering great content for free is for you to subscribe to my channel. So please hit subscribe, stay in touch, go to my website www.sorayalane.com. Find me on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter. I'd love to hear from you and connect with you. And I promise, if you ask me a question, I will do Q&A sessions so I can answer those questions and really help you on your journey to publication. Don't forget, you're in your apprenticeship years. If you're not published yet, you will be published if you keep working hard. But you need to work on your craft. You need to keep writing that next story. Don't ever give up, and really do believe in yourself and believe that you are a quality storyteller, that you actually can do this. I believe in you and I want you to do the same. See you next week.